There is a saying, often repeated by those who study the past: history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Most people hear this phrase and nod in agreement, thinking of general patterns, the rise and fall of empires, the cycles of war and peace, the endless dance of power and rebellion. But what happens when history does more than rhyme? What happens when it seems to repeat itself with such precision that coincidence becomes difficult to accept? Two American presidents, elected exactly 100 years apart, both assassinated on a Friday, both shot in the head, both succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson. A novelist who wrote about a great ship called Titan striking an iceberg 14 years before the Titanic met the same fate. Two Roman empires, separated by nearly 1,000 years, both falling under emperors who shared names with their empire's founders. Two kings on opposite sides of Europe, both overthrown by revolution, both executed with their families. Their stories so similar they seem like the same tragedy told twice. These are not vague similarities. These are specific, documented parallels that have puzzled historians, fascinated researchers, and sparked endless debate. They raise a question that has no easy answer. Is history truly random? A chaotic sequence of events with no underlying order? Or are there hidden patterns woven into the fabric of human experience? Echoes that connect distant centuries in ways we do not fully understand. The stories that follow may not provide definitive answers, but they will make you wonder. Long before modern historians began debating the nature of historical patterns, ancient philosophers grappled with the same questions. The Greeks developed a concept of cyclical time, believing that history moved in great circles rather than straight lines. Just as the seasons returned year after year, they believed that human events also followed recurring patterns. Empires would rise, flourish, decline, and fall, only to be replaced by new empires that would follow the same path. This idea was not limited to Greece. Ancient Hindu philosophy spoke of vast cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Chinese scholars observed dynastic patterns that seemed to repeat across centuries. The Roman historian Polybius wrote about the cycle of constitutions, arguing that governments naturally evolved from monarchy to tyranny to aristocracy to democracy and eventually back to monarchy again. Across cultures and continents, thoughtful observers noticed that human affairs seemed to follow recurring rhythms. The human brain is remarkably skilled at detecting patterns. This ability evolved over millions of years because it helped our ancestors survive. Those who noticed that certain plants were poisonous, that predators hunted at particular times, or that weather followed seasonal cycles had a significant advantage. Pattern recognition became hardwired into our cognitive architecture. But this same ability can lead us astray. Our brains are so eager to find patterns that we sometimes perceive connections where none exist. We see faces in clouds, hear meaningful words in random noise, and find significance in numerical coincidences. Psychologists call this tendency apophenia, perception of meaningful connections between unrelated things. It is not a flaw in human reasoning, but rather an overextension of a normally useful mental capacity. When we examine historical events for patterns, confirmation bias often shapes what we find. We remember the similarities and forget the differences. The famous list of parallels between Lincoln and Kennedy, for example, includes dozens of striking connections, but it conveniently ignores the countless ways in which the two presidents were different: their backgrounds, their policies, their personalities, and the circumstances of their times. If we searched hard enough, we could probably find surprising parallels between almost any two historical figures. The more facts we have to work with, the more potential connections exist. This does not mean that all perceived patterns are illusions, but it does mean we should approach claims of historical repetition with careful skepticism. Despite the warnings of skeptics, historical echoes continue to fascinate us. There is something deeply satisfying about discovering that events separated by centuries share unexpected connections. These discoveries make history feel less random and more meaningful. They suggest that we are part of a larger story, connected to people who lived long before us, and perhaps to those who will live long after. This emotional appeal is not necessarily a weakness. The sense of connection that echoes provide can inspire deeper interest in history and encourage reflection on the human condition. The danger lies not in feeling moved by historical patterns, but in accepting them uncritically or attributing supernatural causes to what may be coincidence. Some historical parallels result from similar conditions, producing similar outcomes. When two societies face comparable challenges, economic crisis, social inequality, weak leadership, external threats, they often respond in comparable ways. The revolutions that overthrew the French and Russian monarchies shared many features because both countries were experiencing similar structural problems. These are not mysterious coincidences, but predictable consequences of analogous circumstances. Structural echoes are perhaps the least surprising type of historical repetition. They remind us that human societies, despite their surface differences, often face the same fundamental challenges. Economic systems can become unstable in similar ways. Political institutions can decay along comparable paths. Social tensions can build and explode following recognizable patterns. Understanding these structural similarities helps us learn from the past and potentially avoid repeating its mistakes. Other parallels appear to be pure coincidence, random alignments of facts that create the illusion of meaningful connection. The specific dates, names, and numbers that link Lincoln and Kennedy likely fall into this category. There is no causal mechanism that would explain why both presidents were elected in years ending in 60 or why both were succeeded by men named Johnson. These are accidents of history, striking when noticed, but signifying nothing deeper. Distinguishing coincidental echoes from meaningful patterns is not always easy. The human mind resists accepting that remarkable similarities can arise by chance. Yet in a world containing billions of events across thousands of years, some extraordinary coincidences are statistically inevitable. The challenge lies in recognizing which parallels deserve serious analysis and which are merely curious accidents. Perhaps the most unsettling type of echo involves cases where fiction or prophecy seem to anticipate reality. The novel about the Titan, written 14 years before the Titanic sank, falls into this category. Such cases challenge our understanding of causation and time. Did the author somehow foresee the future? Did the novel influence the designers of the real ship? Or is this simply an extraordinary coincidence that we remember precisely because it seems so improbable? Predictive echoes occupy an uncomfortable space between rational explanation and genuine mystery. Skeptics can usually find ways to explain them. The author had maritime expertise. The similarities are exaggerated. We only notice the predictions that came true while forgetting countless failed prophecies. Yet some cases resist easy dismissal, leaving us to wonder whether our understanding of time and causation is as complete as we assume. The four echoes we will examine span nearly 2,000 years of history. Each represents a different type of historical parallel, from the coincidental to the structural to the seemingly predictive. Together, they offer a comprehensive look at the phenomenon of repeating history. Our journey begins with the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, two American presidents whose deaths share a remarkable number of specific parallels. This case has become perhaps the most famous example of historical coincidence, inspiring both genuine wonder and healthy skepticism. Next, we will explore the strange case of the Titan and the Titanic, a work of fiction that described a maritime disaster with uncanny accuracy years before it actually occurred. This echo raises profound questions about prediction, coincidence, and the boundaries of human foresight. We will then turn to ancient history, examining how both the Western and Eastern Roman empires fell under emperors whose names echoed those of the empire's founders. Separated by nearly 1,000 years, these two endings share a symmetry that has fascinated historians for centuries. Finally, we will compare the fates of Louis XVI of France and Nicholas II of Russia, two monarchs whose reigns and deaths followed remarkably similar patterns, despite occurring 125 years apart. This echo illustrates how structural similarities can produce parallel tragedies across different eras. Each case offers its own lessons about history, coincidence, and the human search for meaning. Together, they invite us to consider whether history truly rhymes and, if so, what that might mean for our understanding of the past and the future. The first echo takes us to two American presidents, two fateful days, and a list of parallels that continues to astonish. By April 1865, the American Civil War was finally drawing to a close. For 4 long years, the nation had torn itself apart over the questions of slavery and union. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died on battlefields from Gettysburg to Vicksburg. Cities had burned. Families had been divided. And, through it all, President Abraham Lincoln had guided the nation with a combination of political skill, moral conviction, and profound personal sorrow. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The news spread across the country, bringing celebrations in the North and resignation in the South. The war was essentially over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery would be abolished. Lincoln had achieved what many had thought impossible. The president was exhausted but hopeful. He spoke of reconciliation and healing, of binding up the nation's wounds. He looked forward to the enormous task of reconstruction that lay ahead, but he would never see that work completed. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The play was a comedy called Our American Cousin, and the Lincolns were accompanied by a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. The president's usual bodyguard, William Crook, had been replaced for the evening by John Parker, a man with a troubled record who would later leave his post unattended. The presidential box was decorated with flags and provided a clear view of the stage. Lincoln settled into a rocking chair, finally able to relax after years of unimaginable stress. The audience was delighted to have the president among them. Laughter filled the theater as the comedy unfolded below. Shortly after 10 o'clock, during the third act, a figure moved quietly through the shadows behind the presidential box. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and passionate Confederate sympathizer, had planned this moment carefully. He knew the play well and had timed his approach to coincide with a line that always drew loud laughter. When the audience erupted, Boots opened the door to the box, raised his Derringer pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward, mortally wounded. Booth slashed at Major Rathbone with a knife, then leaped to the stage below, breaking his leg in the fall. According to some accounts, he shouted Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, before escaping into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors could do nothing but wait. He never regained consciousness. At 7:22 the next morning, Abraham Lincoln died. He was the first American president to be assassinated. Nearly a century later, another young president captured the imagination of the American people. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected in 1960, becoming the youngest man ever elected to the presidency and the first Roman Catholic to hold the office. He brought energy, optimism, and a sense of style to the White House that seemed to mark a new era in American life. Kennedy's presidency was defined by the tensions of the Cold War. He faced down the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, established the Peace Corps, and committed America to landing a man on the moon. He spoke of a new frontier of challenges and opportunities. Like Lincoln, he led a nation deeply divided not by civil war, but by the growing struggle for civil rights. By November 1963, Kennedy was already looking toward his re-election campaign the following year. Texas was a politically important state, and the president traveled there to mend fences between feuding factions of the Democratic Party. He arrived in Dallas on November 20, accompanied by his wife Jacqueline and an entourage of staff and security. The morning was bright and clear, and the crowds that lined the streets were enthusiastic. The presidential motorcade wound through downtown Dallas in an open-top limousine, allowing the people to see their president and first lady up close. Kennedy smiled and waved. Jackie, in her famous pink suit, sat beside him. The route took the motorcade through Dealey Plaza, past the Texas Schoolbook Depository, a warehouse where a troubled young man named Lee Harvey Oswald had taken a position at a sixth-floor window. Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union before returning to the United States, had brought a rifle to work that day. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, as the motorcade passed below, shots rang out. President Kennedy was struck in the neck and then in the head. He fell into his wife's arms, fatally wounded. Governor John Connally of Texas, seated in front of the president, was also seriously wounded but would survive. The limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but there was nothing doctors could do. At 1:00 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. Like Lincoln before him, he had been shot in the head on a Friday, with his wife beside him, by an assassin who would never stand trial. The parallels extend to the men who killed these presidents. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939 again, exactly 100 years later. Both assassins were known by their three names. Both were Southerners who held extremist political views. Both were killed before they could stand trial. Booth shot by a soldier during his capture. Oswald shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby 2 days after Kennedy's death. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and was cornered in a warehouse. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. This reversal of locations has struck many observers as particularly uncanny. Both assassins were in their mid-20s at the time of their crimes. Both were killed by single gunshots. While the Lincoln-Kennedy parallels are genuinely striking, it is important to note what the famous lists do not include: the many ways in which the two presidents and their assassinations were different. These differences are often overlooked because they do not fit the narrative of mysterious repetition. Lincoln was born in rural poverty and largely so. Kennedy was born into enormous wealth and attended elite schools. Lincoln was tall and physically awkward. Kennedy was handsome and athletic. Lincoln's assassination was part of a larger conspiracy to kill multiple government officials, while Kennedy appears to have been killed by a lone gunman. The political contexts of their times were vastly different. Furthermore, some of the parallels on popular lists do not hold up to scrutiny. The claim that both presidents' successors were born exactly 100 years apart is true, but the claim that both presidents were elected exactly 100 years apart is also true, and when you have to. Data points that match a 100-year gap. Finding additional 100-year gaps becomes a mathematical likelihood rather than a mystery. Historians also point out that if we looked hard enough, we could probably find dozens of parallels between any two major historical figures. The Lincoln-Kennedy comparison has become famous, not because the parallels are inexplicable, but because both men were beloved presidents who died tragically. Their deaths traumatized the nation, and the search for parallels reflects a very human need to find meaning in senseless tragedy. Yet even skeptical historians acknowledge that the sheer number of specific coincidences is unusual. Whether these parallels mean anything remains a question each person must answer for themselves. In 1898, an American author named Morgan Robertson published a short novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Robertson was not a famous writer. He had spent years working as a merchant sailor before turning to fiction, and his stories often drew on his maritime experience. The novel received modest attention at the time and was quickly forgotten by most readers. The plot was straightforward. The Titan was described as the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, a triumph of modern engineering that was considered practically unsinkable. On an April voyage across the North Atlantic, the ship struck an iceberg and sank, with massive loss of life due to an insufficient number of lifeboats. Robertson's fictional ship was about 800 feet long and displaced approximately 75,000 tons. It could carry about 3,000 passengers and crew. It had 3 propellers and could reach speeds of 24 to 25 knots. The novel described the ship as unsinkable because of its watertight compartments, which gave passengers and crew a false sense of security. These details would have seemed like pure imagination in 1898. No ship matching that description existed, and none was being planned. Robertson was simply extrapolating from trends in shipbuilding, imagining what the ultimate ocean liner might look like. He was also a fatalist who believed that technological hubris would inevitably lead to disaster. Futility was not a bestseller. It was a cautionary tale about overconfidence and the danger of believing that humans could conquer nature. The story was dark and tragic, lacking the happy ending that Victorian readers often preferred. Robertson continued writing other works, never imagining that his forgotten novel would one day become famous for entirely unexpected reasons. The book went out of print and seemed destined for obscurity. Morgan Robertson would struggle financially for most of his remaining life, dying in 1915, just 3 years after the events that would make his novel infamous. In the early 1900s, competition among transatlantic shipping companies was fierce. The British company Cunard had recently launched 2 magnificent liners, the Lusitania and Mauretania, which were the fastest ships on the Atlantic. The rival White Star Line, owned by American financier J.P. Morgan, decided to respond not with speed but with size and luxury. The White Star Line commissioned 3 enormous vessels, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, from the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. These ships would be the largest and most luxurious ever built, floating palaces that would redefine ocean travel. The Titanic, in particular, was designed to be the ultimate expression of Edwardian elegance and engineering prowess. Construction began in 1909, and the ship took shape over the following years. When completed, the Titanic was 882 feet long, about 80 feet longer than Robertson's fictional Titan. It displaced approximately 50 tons and could carry over 2,200 passengers and crew. It had 3 propellers and could reach speeds of about 22 to 23 knots. In the years following Kennedy's assassination, people began noticing an unusual number of parallels between his death and Lincoln's. These similarities were compiled into lists that circulated widely, eventually becoming one of the most famous examples of apparent historical coincidence. While some of these parallels have been exaggerated or misrepresented over time, many are genuinely documented. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were elected to Congress in years ending in 46. Lincoln in 1846, Kennedy in 1946. Both were elected president in years ending in Lincoln in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both were deeply concerned with civil rights for African Americans. Both were assassinated on a Friday. Both were shot in the head from behind. Both were killed in the presence of their wives. Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was killed while riding in a Lincoln automobile made by the Ford Motor Company. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who reportedly warned him not to go to the theater. Kennedy had a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln. While this parallel is often repeated, historians have found limited evidence for Lincoln's secretary issuing such a warning. Both presidents were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was born in 1908, exactly 100 years later. Both Johnsons were Southern Democrats who had previously served in the United States Senate. The parallels extend to TH-39E, men who killed these presidents. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939 again, exactly 100 years later. Both assassins were known by their 3 names. Both were Southerners who held extremist political views. Both were killed before they could stand trial. Booth shot by a soldier during his capture. Oswald shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby 2 days after Kennedy's death. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and was cornered in a warehouse. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. This reversal of locations has struck many observers as particularly uncanny. Both assassins were in their mid-20s at the time of their crimes. Both were killed by single gunshots. In 1898, an American author named Morgan Robertson published a short novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Robertson was not a famous writer. He had spent years working as a merchant sailor before turning to fiction, and his stories often drew on his maritime experience. The novel received modest attention at the time and was quickly forgotten by most readers. The plot was straightforward. The Titan was described as the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, a triumph of modern engineering that was considered practically unsinkable. On an April voyage across the North Atlantic, the ship struck an iceberg and sank, with massive loss of life due to an insufficient number of lifeboats. Robertson's fictional ship was about 800 feet long and displaced approximately 75,000 tons. It could carry about 3,000 passengers and crew. It had 3 propellers and could reach speeds of 24 to 25 knots. The novel described the ship as unsinkable because of its watertight compartments, which gave passengers and crew a false sense of security. These details would have seemed like pure imagination in 1898. No ship matching that description existed, and none was being planned. Robertson was simply extrapolating from trends in shipbuilding, imagining what the ultimate ocean liner might look like. He was also a fatalist who believed that technological hubris would inevitably lead to disaster. Futility was not a bestseller. It was a cautionary tale about overconfidence and the danger of believing that humans could conquer nature. The story was dark and tragic, lacking the happy ending that Victorian readers often preferred. Robertson continued writing other works, never imagining that his forgotten novel would one day become famous for entirely unexpected reasons. The book went out of print and seemed destined for obscurity. Morgan Robertson would struggle financially for most of his remaining life, dying in 1915, just 3 years after the events that would make his novel infamous. LTW, the Titanic's designers, incorporated advanced safety features. including a double bottom and 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed with the flip of a switch. The ship was designed to stay afloat even if 4 of these compartments were flooded. This engineering led to confident statements about the ship's safety. The trade publication Shipbuilder described the Titanic as practically unsinkable. This phrase, intended as a reassurance about the ship's advanced design, would become tragically ironic. Over time, popular memory has transformed it into a hubristic boast that tempted fate. By April 1912, the Titanic was ready for its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. It was the largest ship afloat, a symbol of human achievement and technological progress. Passengers paid enormous sums for the privilege of sailing on this magnificent vessel. Few could have imagined that many of them would never reach their destination. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic departed Southampton under the command of Captain Edward Smith, a veteran sailor on his final voyage before retirement. The ship stopped at Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up additional passengers before heading into the open Atlantic. Among those aboard were some of the wealthiest people in the world, along with hundreds of immigrants seeking new lives in America. For the first 4 days, the voyage proceeded smoothly. The weather was calm, and passengers enjoyed the ship's remarkable amenities. The grand staircase, the elegant dining rooms, the swimming pool, and the Turkish bath. The Titanic seemed to justify every boast that had been made about her. The wireless messages were arriving with warnings. Other ships in the area were reporting ice. The winter of 1911 to 1912 had been unusually mild, causing more icebergs than normal to drift into the shipping lanes. Captain Smith adjusted the ship's course slightly southward but did not reduce speed. The Titanic continued toward New York at approximately 22 knots. On the night of April 14th, the sea was calm and the sky was clear, conditions that actually made icebergs harder to spot, since there were no waves breaking against them. At 11:40 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet spotted a dark shape directly ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered the engines reversed, and the helm turned hard to starboard. The ship began to turn, but it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull, buckling plates and popping rivets below the waterline. The contact lasted only about 10 seconds, but the damage was fatal. Water began pouring into the forward compartments. Within minutes, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who was aboard for the maiden voyage, inspected the damage and delivered devastating news. The first 5 compartments were flooding. The ship could float with 4 flooded, but not 5. The Titanic was going to sink, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. What followed were 2 hours and 40 minutes of horror and heroism. The ship carried lifeboats for only about 1,200 people, roughly half of those aboard. Many boats were launched only partially filled, either because officers feared overloading them, or because passengers did not initially believe the ship was in serious danger. As the bow sank lower and the stern rose higher, panic spread. Women and children were given priority for the lifeboats, though the rule was not universally enforced. Some men disguised themselves or pushed their way aboard. Others accepted their fate with remarkable calm. The ship's band famously continued playing as the deck tilted beneath them. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, the Titanic broke apart and plunged to meet the surface. Over 1,500 people died, most from hypothermia in the freezing water. The survivors, floating in lifeboats in the darkness, could hear the cries of the dying gradually fade to silence. When readers rediscovered Morgan Robertson's novel after the disaster, the parallels seemed almost impossible. The fictional Titan was 800 feet long. The Titanic was 882 feet. The Titan displaced 75,000 tons. The Titanic displaced 52,000. The Titan carried about 3,000 people. The Titanic carried about 2,200. The Titan could make 25 knots. The Titanic could make about 22. Both ships were described as unsinkable. Both struck icebergs on the starboard side during April crossings of the North Atlantic. Both sank with massive loss of life because they carried too few lifeboats. Both represented the pinnacle of maritime technology in their respective eras. Even the names were remarkably similar, Titan and Titanic, differing by only 2 letters. Robertson could not have known that White Star would choose such a similar name for their great ship. Yet somehow, he had imagined a vessel and a disaster that would materialize in reality 14 years later. The question has haunted readers ever since. Did Morgan Robertson somehow foresee the future? Was he tapping into some supernatural source of knowledge? Or is there a more mundane explanation for these extraordinary parallels? Skeptics point out that Robertson was an experienced sailor who understood shipbuilding trends. By 1898, ships were getting larger, and it was reasonable to extrapolate that the trend would continue. Icebergs were a known danger in the North Atlantic, and insufficient lifeboats were a common problem on ships of that era. Robertson was essentially warning about a disaster that maritime experts knew was possible. Furthermore, not all the parallels are as close as they first appear. The tonnage figures differ significantly. Robertson got some technical details wrong, and the novel's plot differs from the real disaster in important ways in the book. The ship sinks quickly, while the Titanic took over 2 hours to go down. Yet these explanations do not entirely dispel the mystery. Robertson's novel was not a general warning about maritime safety. It was a specific story about a specific ship with a specific name meeting a specific fate. The accumulated coincidences remain remarkable, even if each individual parallel can be explained. The Roman Empire had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries, but by the 5th century AD, its western half was dying. The causes were many and complex: economic troubles, military pressures, political instability, and the gradual transformation of Roman society under the influence of Germanic peoples who had settled within imperial borders. Rome itself had ceased to be the true capital of the empire long before the final end. Emperors ruled from Ravenna in northern Italy, which was easier to defend. The great legions that had once conquered the known world were now largely composed of Germanic mercenaries whose loyalty was uncertain. The cities of the West were shrinking, trade was declining, and the sophisticated administrative system that had made Roman rule possible was breaking down. What remained was a hollow shell emperors, who reigned but did not rule, armies that fought for their commanders rather than the state, and a population that increasingly looked to local strongmen and the Christian church for protection and identity. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was less a sudden collapse than a slow fading, a gradual transformation from one world into another. By the mid-5th century, Germanic kingdoms had established themselves on what had been Roman soil. The Vandals held North Africa. The Visigoths controlled much of Spain and southern Gaul. The Franks were expanding in northern Gaul. Italy itself was threatened by various Germanic groups, and the emperors who sat in Ravenna depended on barbarian generals for their survival. The man who would finally extinguish the Western Empire was himself a barbarian general in Roman service. Odoacer was a chieftain of the Heruli, a Germanic tribe, and he commanded a portion of the Roman army in Italy. In 476 AD, he decided that the fiction of Roman imperial rule had outlived its usefulness. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was a teenager named Romulus Augustus. Commonly known by the diminutive Romulus Augustulus Little Augustus, he had been placed on the throne by his father, Orestes, a Roman general who had made himself the power behind the imperial title. Romulus himself held no real authority. He was a puppet, a figurehead, a child playing at being emperor while real power lay elsewhere. The irony of his name was not lost on contemporaries. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome, the man who had established the city nearly 1,200 years before. Augustus was the title of the first emperor, the man who had transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. Now, as the empire crumbled, its last ruler bore both names, a symbolic bookend to Roman history. In August 476 AD, Odoacer and his Germanic soldiers demanded land in Italy as payment for their service. When Orestes refused, Orestes was captured and executed. The young Romulus Augustulus, alone and powerless, awaited his fate. What happened next was surprisingly anticlimactic. Odoacer had no desire to martyr the boy emperor. Instead, he simply deposed Romulus and sent him into comfortable retirement at a villa in Campania, with a pension to support him. The Imperia Regalia was sent to Constantinople, where the Eastern Roman emperors still reigned. Odoacer took the title King of Italy and ruled in his own name. No one at the time seemed to realize that a world historical moment had occurred. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand, no final speech. The Western Roman Empire simply ceased to exist, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Historians would later mark 476 AD as the end of ancient history and the beginning of the Middle Ages, but for those who lived through it, life went on much as before. While the West crumbled, the Eastern Roman Empire, what historians would later call the Byzantine Empire, from its capital at Constantinople, the Eastern Empire maintained Roman traditions, Roman law, and Roman identity for another 1,000 years. The citizens of this empire called themselves Romans, and in their own eyes, they were the legitimate continuation of the empire that had ruled the Mediterranean world. Constantinople itself was one of the greatest cities in the world. Founded by the Emperor Constantine in 330 AD on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, it occupied a magnificent position at the junction of Europe and Asia. Massive walls protected it from land attack, while its location on a peninsula made naval assault extremely difficult. For centuries, Constantinople was considered impregnable. The Byzantine Empire experienced periods of great strength and periods of dangerous weakness. It faced invasions from Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Slavs. It suffered civil wars, plagues, and economic crises, yet it always survived, adapting and enduring where the Western Empire had failed. The most devastating blow came not from Muslims or pagans, but from fellow Christians. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, originally intended to attack Egypt, was diverted against Constantinople itself. The Crusaders, allied with Venice, captured and sacked the great city, stealing its treasures and establishing a Latin empire on its ruins. Though the Byzantines eventually recovered Constantinople in 1261, the empire never fully regained its former strength. The territories it controlled shrank steadily. The population declined. The treasury emptied. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. It was an empire in name only, surrounded on all sides by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The man who would be the last Byzantine emperor bore a name heavy with symbolism. Constantine XI. Palaiologos was named after Constantine the Great, the emperor who had founded Constantinople over 1,000 years before. Just as the last Western emperor bore the name of Rome's founder, the last Eastern emperor bore the name of his empire's founder. Constantine XI became emperor in 1449, inheriting a desperate situation. The Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II had made clear their intention to take Constantinople. The great city that had withstood so many sieges was now virtually defenseless, its population reduced to perhaps 50,000, its walls too long for the few thousand defenders available to man them. The emperor sought help from the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe, but aid was slow in coming and insufficient when it arrived. A few hundred soldiers from Genoa and Venice joined the defense, along with some Greek volunteers. Against them stood an Ottoman army of perhaps 80,000 men, equipped with massive cannons capable of breaching the ancient walls. The siege of Constantinople began in April 1453. For nearly 2 months, the Ottoman cannons pounded the walls while the defenders made desperate repairs. Sultan Mehmed tried various strategies to direct assault, tunneling, even dragging ships over land to bypass the chain that blocked the harbor. The defenders held on, but their numbers dwindled and their supplies ran low. On the night of May 22nd, a lunar eclipse cast the moon in blood-red shadow, fulfilling an old prophecy that Constantinople would fall when the moon gave a sign. Morale among the defenders collapsed further. Religious processions wound through the streets as the people prayed for deliverance that would not come. The final assault came on May 29, 1453. Ottoman troops poured through breaches in the walls and overwhelmed the exhausted defenders. Constantinonce, refusing to flee or surrender, reportedly cast off his imperium regalia and plunged into the fighting. His body was never positively identified. He died as he had lived as a Roman emperor. With the fall of Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire finally ceased to exist. The Imperial II for 76 AD was not lost on those who contemplated it. The Western Empire had fallen under an emperor named Romulus, echoing the city's legendary founder. The Eastern Empire fell under an emperor named Constantine, echoing the city's historical founder. Both emperors were the last of their lines. Both presided over empires that had declined over centuries. Both represented the end of worlds that had seemed eternal. The symmetry was too striking to ignore, even if it was surely coincidence. Separated by nearly 1,000 years, These two endings formed a single story, the story of Rome's rise and fall, of human ambition and human limitation, of empires that once seemed invincible crumbling into dust. The Bourbon dynasty had ruled France for over 200 years when Louis VI ascended the throne in 1774. It was one of the most powerful royal houses in Europe, having transformed France into the dominant nation on the continent. But beneath the glittering surface of Versailles, the kingdom was rotting. France faced a severe financial crisis, largely caused by expensive wars and the extravagant spending of the royal court. The tax system was hopelessly unfair, with the burden falling mainly on the peasants while the nobility and clergy enjoyed exemptions. Social inequality was extreme, with a small aristocratic elite enjoying vast privileges, while the common people struggled with poverty and hunger. Louis XVI inherited these problems, but lacked the political skill to solve them. He was not a bad man by most accounts. He was personally decent, well-meaning, and devoted to his family, but he was indecisive, easily influenced, and unable to grasp the urgency of reform. He preferred working on locks and hunting to the hard work of governance. Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, was an Austrian princess who never won the love of the French people. She was accused of extravagance and foreign influence, becoming a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. While many of the stories about her were exaggerated or false, she never actually said, "Let them eat cake." She did little to counter her negative image. Together, Louis and Marie Antoinette presided over a court that seemed increasingly out of touch with the suffering of ordinary people. When harvests failed and bread prices soared, the contrast between royal luxury and popular misery became impossible to ignore. MC y 39 N. 1789. The financial crisis forced Louis to convene the Estate, a representative assembly that had not met in over 170 years. The meeting quickly spiraled out of control. The representatives of the common people, frustrated by the privileged orders, declared themselves a national assembly and began demanding fundamental changes. On July 14, 1789, a Parisian mob stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison that symbolized monarchical tyranny. The French Revolution had begun. Over the following months, the assembly abolished feudal privileges, issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and stripped the king of much of his power. Louis and his family found themselves increasingly isolated and threatened. In June 1791, they attempted to flee France, hoping to reach safety abroad and rally foreign support, but they were recognized at the town of Varennes and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The failed flight destroyed what remained of Louis's credibility. Many now saw him as a traitor who had abandoned his people. The revolution grew more radical over time. France went to war against Austria and Prussia, and as military defeats mounted, popular anger focused on the king. In August 1792, a mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, massacring the royal guards. Louis and his family were arrested and imprisoned. In September 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and France was declared a republic. Louis, now called simply Citizen Louis Capet, was put on trial for treason. Despite his lawyers' arguments, the outcome was never in doubt. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. He was 38 years old. Marie Antoinette followed her husband to the guillotine 9 months later. Their son, Louis Charles, died in prison at age 10, likely from tuberculosis and neglect. Their daughter, Maritha Arase, survived, eventually released in a prisoner exchange. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for over 300 years when Nicholas II became Tsar in 1894. Like the Bourbons in France, the Romanovs had built one of Europe's most powerful states. But Russia, too, was struggling with severe problems that its rulers seemed unable to address. Russia remained a largely agricultural society in an age of industrialization. Most of its vast population were peasants living in conditions not far removed from medieval serfdom, although serfdom had been formally abolished in 1861. The reforms had not delivered the land and freedom that peasants desired. Urban workers labored in terrible conditions for low wages. A small revolutionary movement advocated violent overthrow of the regime. The political system was equally backward. Russia had no parliament, no constitution, and no legal political parties. The Tsar ruled as an autocrat, answerable to no one but God. While some reform-minded officials tried to modernize the country, they faced constant resistance from conservative forces, determined to preserve traditional power structures. Nicholas II was not suited to the role that history thrust upon him. He was a devoted family man who adored his wife Alexandra and their 5 children, 4 daughters, and a son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Nicholas was gentle, polite, and well-intentioned. He was also politically naive, stubborn in small matters while yielding on large ones, and prone to poor judgment in choosing advisors. Alexandra, a German princess who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy, was deeply unpopular. Her Germanic origins made her suspect during World War I, when Russia was fighting Germany. Her reliance on the mystic Grigory Rasputin, who seemed able to ease young Alexei's bleeding episodes, scandalized Russian society. Like Louis XVI before him, Nicholas II was a decent man who proved incapable of mastering the. In 1914, Russia entered World War I as an ally of France and Britain against Germany and Austria. The war went badly from the start. Russian armies suffered catastrophic defeats. Millions of soldiers died or were captured. The economy strained under the pressure of total war. Food shortages led to rising unrest in the cities. By early 1917, the situation had become critical. In February, bread riots in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, escalated into a general uprising. Soldiers sent to suppress the protests joined them instead. The Duma, Russia's weak parliament, formed a provisional government. Nicholas, isolated and without support, abdicated the throne on March 15, 1917. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty had fallen. The provisional government initially placed Nicholas and his family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace, near They hoped to send the family into exile, perhaps to Britain, where King George V was Nicholas's cousin. But British concerns about public opinion led to the withdrawal of the invitation. The family remained trapped in Russia. There is something both exhilarating and unsettling about recognizing patterns in history. When we discover that events separated by centuries share unexpected parallels, we experience a moment of revelation. The past suddenly feels less distant, less foreign, more intimately connected to our own experience. We sense that we are part of something larger than ourselves, participants in a story that stretches back through time and forward into an unknowable future. But this sense of connection carries weight. If history truly repeats, what does that mean for human agency? Are we free to shape our own destinies, or are we caught in cycles we cannot escape? The monarchs who fell to revolution, Louis XVI and Nicholas II, were not ignorant of history. They knew what had happened to rulers who lost the confidence of their people. Yet knowing the pattern did not save them from repeating it. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of historical echoes. They suggest that awareness alone is not enough. Seeing the pattern does not guarantee the ability to break free from it. We may be destined to repeat the mistakes of our ancestors, not because we are ignorant, but because some forces are simply too powerful to resist. For many people, the idea that history follows patterns is deeply comforting. It suggests that the universe is not random, that events have meaning and purpose, that our lives are part of a coherent narrative rather than a chaotic jumble of accidents. This comfort is especially welcome when contemplating tragedy. The deaths of Lincoln and Kennedy were devastating losses for the American nation. Finding parallels between these deaths, even parallels that may signify nothing, makes them feel less senseless. If these men were connected across time, if their fates were somehow linked, then their deaths become part of a larger story rather than mere random violence. But the same patterns that comfort can also terrify. If history repeats, then the tragedies of the past may await us in the future. If great ships can sink despite being called unsinkable, what faith can we place in our own technological achievements? If empires that seem eternal can crumble to dust, what security can any civilization truly possess? The echoes remind us that we are not as safe as we like to believe. The same forces that destroyed past generations remain present in our world. The patterns that ensnared our ancestors may ensnare us as well. This is not a comfortable thought, but it may be a necessary one. One of the most poignant aspects of historical echoes is the frequency with which people repeat patterns they consciously seek to avoid. Nicholas II was well aware of the fate of Louis XVI. The Russian Tsar had studied French history and understood the dangers of revolution. Yet this knowledge did not prevent him from following a remarkably similar path to destruction. Why does knowledge fail to protect us? Part of the answer lies in the nature of historical crises. By the time a ruler recognizes the pattern, it may already be too late to escape. Louis XVI attempted reforms, but his reforms came too slowly and satisfied no one. Nicholas II made concessions after the Revolution of 1905, but his concessions were insufficient, and his heart was never in them. Both men tried to change course, but the forces they faced were too powerful. Another part of the answer lies in human nature itself. We tend to believe that we are different, that the rules that apply to others do not apply to us. Louis XVI could not truly imagine himself on the scaffold. Nicholas II could not truly imagine his family murdered in a basement. The fate of predecessors feels like history, something that happened to other people in other times, not a warning about our own future. Philosophers have long debated whether humanity can learn from history. The optimistic view holds that by studying the past, we can avoid repeating its mistakes. The pessimistic view holds that each generation must learn its lessons anew, that the wisdom of the past cannot truly be transmitted to those who have not lived through similar experiences. The echoes we have examined suggest a complex reality somewhere between these extremes. We can learn from history. Our societies have made genuine progress in many areas, but our learning is imperfect and selective. We remember some lessons while forgetting others. We apply the lessons of the past to the wrong problems, or apply them too late. We convince ourselves that our situation is different, that the old patterns no longer apply. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that historical knowledge is necessary but not sufficient for avoiding repetition. Understanding the patterns of the past helps us recognize similar patterns in the present. But recognition is only the first step. Acting effectively on that recognition requires wisdom, courage, and often luck that may not be available when we need them most. The historical echoes we have explored have become part of our collective cultural memory. The Lincoln-Kennedy parallels are known to millions who could not name any other fact about either president. The Titanic disaster, amplified by its connection to Robertson's novel, has become the defining symbol of technological hubris. The fall of Rome serves as a template for understanding the decline of any civilization. These stories shape how we see the world. When we speak of something being unsinkable, we invoke the Titanic. When we worry about the decline of Western civilization, we think of Rome. When we contemplate the vulnerability of leaders, Lincoln and Kennedy come to mind. The echoes have become archetypes, patterns that we apply to new situations as a way of understanding them. This is both useful and dangerous. The patterns provide frameworks for interpretation that can illuminate genuine similarities, but they can also blind us to important differences. Not every declining nation is Rome. Not every technological marvel is the Titanic. Not every political crisis leads to revolution. Sometimes the patterns mislead us, causing us to see repetition where none exists. What these stories ultimately reveal is the power of narrative in human life. We are creatures who understand the world through stories. The past is not a collection of random facts, but a tapestry of narratives that we weave together to create meaning. Historical echoes are compelling because they fit naturally into narrative structure. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. They feature recurring characters and repeating themes. They satisfy our deep need for stories that make sense. This narrative instinct is neither purely rational nor purely irrational. It is simply human. The challenge is to harness its power while remaining aware of its limitations. The best historians combine narrative skill with critical rigor, telling compelling stories while acknowledging what they do not know. The best readers of history appreciate the power of echoes while maintaining appropriate skepticism about their meaning. After all our analysis, we return to a fundamental truth. We do not know with certainty why history sometimes seems to repeat itself. We have theories and explanations, some more convincing than others. But the deepest questions remain open. Is the universe orderly or chaotic? Are the patterns we perceive real or imagined? Does history have a direction and purpose? Or is it merely one thing after another? These questions may have no final answers, but perhaps that is acceptable. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Some questions are valuable precisely because they remain open, inviting continued reflection and wonder. The echoes of history are like that, endlessly fascinating, never fully explained, always inviting us to look deeper. If we cannot definitively explain historical echoes, we can still learn from contemplating them. They teach us humility in the face of forces we do not fully understand. They remind us that we are connected to those who came before us, sharing the same human nature. facing similar challenges, capable of similar triumphs and similar failures. They teach us to pay attention. The patterns of the past may not repeat exactly, but they rhyme closely enough to offer guidance. Those who study history carefully may recognize warning signs that others miss. They may not always be able to change the outcome, but awareness is still valuable. It is better to face the future with open eyes than to stumble blindly into patterns we might have foreseen. Above all, the echoes teach us that we are part of a continuous human story. The people who lived through these events were not fundamentally different from us. They loved, feared, hoped, and suffered as we do. Their stories are our stories, separated only by the accident of time. In recognizing the echoes, we recognize ourselves. We have journeyed through centuries of human history, tracing for remarkable instances where the past seemed to repeat itself with uncanny precision. We have walked the streets of Washington and Dallas, where 2 presidents fell to assassins' bullets 100 years apart. We have stood on the decks of 2 great ships, one imaginary, one real as they struck icebergs and slipped beneath the cold Atlantic waters. We have watched 2 Roman empires crumble under emperors whose names echoed their founders. We have witnessed 2 ancient dynasties swept away by revolution, their royal families meeting tragically similar fates. Each echo is remarkable in its own right. Together, they form a pattern of patterns, a tapestry of recurring themes that spans nearly 2,000 years of human experience. The contexts differ: enormously American democracy, British maritime ambition, Roman imperial power, European monarchy. Yet something connects these distant moments, some thread of similarity that the passage of centuries cannot sever. What unites these 4 echoes? On the surface, they share little, yet at a deeper level, they all involve the collision of human ambition with forces beyond human control. Lincoln and Kennedy were struck down at the height of their power. The Titanic sank despite, perhaps because of its builders' confidence in their creation. Rome fell not once but twice, proving that even the mightiest empires are mortal. Louis XVI and Nicholas II learned that thrones built on inequality cannot stand forever. In each case, warnings were available. Lincoln's friends urged him not to attend the theater. Experienced sailors warned of icebergs in the shipping lanes. Observers had noted Rome's decline for generations before the final collapse. Reformers pleaded with the French and Russian monarchs to change course before revolution became inevitable. And in each case, the warnings went unheeded or were heeded too late to matter. This may be the deepest pattern of all. Not that history repeats, but that human beings consistently fail to learn from the patterns they can clearly see. If history truly rhymes, what rhymes are forming in our own time? This question cannot be answered with certainty, but it deserves contemplation. The patterns of the past do not predict the future with precision, but they offer hints about the forces that shape human events. We live in an age of technological confidence, not unlike the era that produced the Titanic. We build systems of enormous complexity and assure ourselves they are too sophisticated to fail. We create financial instruments, computer networks, and social institutions whose interconnections we barely understand. We assume that our expertise has mastered the risks our ancestors faced. We also live in an age of growing inequality, not unlike the eras that produced the French and Russian revolutions. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while millions struggle with economic insecurity. Political systems seem increasingly unable to address the concerns of ordinary people. Trust in institutions erodes year by year. These observations are not predictions. History's rhymes are imperfect, and every era differs from those that came before. The patterns that destroyed past civilizations may not destroy ours. The warnings that went unheeded then may be heeded now. We have capabilities for communication, organization, and problem-solving that our ancestors lacked. Yet awareness brings responsibility. If we can see the patterns, we have an obligation to take them seriously. The echoes of history are not entertainment. They are warnings. They remind us that the forces that brought down empires and sank unsinkable ships remain active in our world. Hubris is still hubris. Inequality still breeds resentment. Leaders who cannot adapt still fall. We cannot know whether we are living through echoes that future generations will study with the same fascination we bring to Lincoln and Kennedy, to Titan and Titanic. But we can resolve to pay attention, to question our assumptions, and to take warnings seriously before it is too late. Why do we study these strange alignments? Not merely to satisfy curiosity, though curiosity is reason enough. We study them because they illuminate something essential about human experience. They remind us that we are not as original as we like to believe. The challenges we face have been faced before. The mistakes we make have been made before. The tragedies we suffer have been suffered before. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of humility and connection. We are part of a continuous human story that stretches back to the beginning of recorded history and forward into an unknown future. The people who lived through these echoes were not fundamentally different from us. Their hopes, fears, loves, and failures are our hopes, fears, loves, and failures. The echoes of history will continue to fascinate and puzzle us. New parallels will emerge as events unfold. Future scholars will debate whether these parallels are meaningful or merely coincidental. The fundamental questions: whether history repeats, whether patterns are real, whether the universe has meaning, will remain open. Perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to endure, inviting each generation to engage with them anew. The echoes do not give us answers. They give us something more valuable: questions worth asking, patterns worth contemplating, connections worth exploring. As you go about your life, remember that you too are a part of history's unfinished rhyme. The choices you make, the warnings you heed or ignore, the patterns you recognize or overlook, all of these become part of the story that future generations will study. The echoes of the past have brought us here. The echoes we create will carry forward into times we will never see. What rhymes are you living through right now? Only time will tell. We have traveled together through centuries of history, exploring for remarkable moments when the past seemed to repeat itself in ways that defy easy explanation. From assassinated presidents to sunken ships, from fallen empires to executed kings, these echoes remind us that history is stranger and more mysterious than we often assume. Now we invite you to join the conversation. Which of these 4 echoes do you find most compelling? The Lincoln Kennedy parallels with their precise, numerical coincidences. The novelist who seemed to predict the Titanic disaster. The 2 Romes falling under emperors, named for their founders, or the twin revolutions that claimed to royal families. Perhaps you know of other historical echoes we did not cover. Share them in the comments below. We are always eager to discover new patterns hiding in the pages of history. And consider this question as you go about your day. What echoes might be forming around us right now? Patterns that future generations will study with wonder. If this journey through history moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with fellow history lovers who appreciate the mysteries of the past. Until next time, keep looking for the patterns.